The US dollar holds its value because the United States declares it so, and the rest of the world accepts this reality, lacking any viable alternative. It's a truth as stark as it is simple, as brutal as it is undeniable. Yet, lurking beneath the surface of global finance is the petrodollar, arguably the most potent mechanism of economic control on the planet. Today, a term unfamiliar to the vast majority. This profound shift began in 1971 with a singular decision that irrevocably altered the trajectory of money itself. President Richard Nixon, addressing the nation, declared that the US dollar would no longer be backed by gold, its value resting solely on faith and trust. Panic rippled across the globe as economists grimly forecasted the imminent collapse of the international financial system. But the collapse never materialized. The system endured, saved by an ingenious yet often overlooked solution: the petrodollar. 3 years later, in 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger journeyed to Saudi Arabia, carrying a proposition the Saudis would find virtually impossible to decline. The core of this landmark agreement was straightforward. Saudi Arabia committed to selling its vast oil reserves exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the United States offered a compelling two-part package. Firstly, comprehensive military protection, including advanced weaponry, specialized training, and a sustained naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Secondly, a guaranteed market for Saudi Arabia's accumulating wealth. The petrodollars they earn would be reinvested directly into U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively financing America's own debt. The Saudis signed the deal, and soon the rest of OPEC followed suit. With this pivotal agreement, the dollar discovered its new foundation, its new bedrock, not gold, but oil. Consider the practical implications of this system. If Japan wishes to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia, it must first acquire U.S. dollars, as Saudi Arabia exclusively accepts this currency. To do so, Japan either sells its goods in dollar-denominated markets or directly purchases dollars on the foreign exchange market. This same dynamic applies to virtually every oil-dependent nation: China, India, Brazil, and indeed almost every country on Earth. The entire global economy, in essence, requires dollars to function, and the United States remains the sole entity capable of creating these dollars. This grants the U.S. an unparalleled privilege in history. It can print money with consequences that would be devastating hyperinflation in any other nation. Yet in this unique scenario, the surplus dollars are simply absorbed by the world economy, which constantly demands them. When the United States faces a fiscal deficit, it prints dollars. When it needs to finance a war, it issues dollar-denominated debt. When its economy requires stimulus, it injects more dollars into the system. And the cost of this privilege, often unknowingly, is borne by the rest of the planet, as their dollar reserves subtly diminish in value each time the printing presses whir to life. The French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously termed this phenomenon the Exorbitant Privilege. A nation that issues the world's primary reserve currency can, in essence, perpetually live beyond its means because the rest of the world effectively finances its debt. The United States currently carries a national debt exceeding $34 trillion, yet it remains the most powerful economy globally. Any other country with a similar debt-to-GDP ratio would undoubtedly find itself on its knees, negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for survival. Now, for the part of the story that few dare to tell. What happens when a nation attempts to challenge or break free from this intricate system? In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. 2 years later, the United States invaded Iraq. The official justification was to dismantle weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. Iraq, however, swiftly resumed selling its oil exclusively in dollars. Muammar Gaddafi harbored an even more audacious plan. He envisioned the creation of an African gold-backed currency, the gold dinar, designed to allow African nations to trade oil and other raw materials without reliance on the US dollar. In 2011, a coalition led by the United States and France militarily supported Libyan rebels. Gaddafi was subsequently captured and killed. The African gold dinar, consequently, never saw the light of day. While it's crucial to state that the petrodollar is not asserted, here is the sole reason for these interventions: geopolitics is inherently complex. The recurring pattern is undeniable and increasingly difficult to ignore. Iran, for its part, has spent decades actively seeking to sell its oil outside the dollar system. Initially in euros, then in Chinese yuan, Russian rubles, and even through direct barter agreements. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States against Iran serve, among other things, as a powerful mechanism to isolate any country that dares to transact outside the dollar-denominated framework from the global financial system. Should your bank engage in business with sanctioned Iranian entities, it risks losing access to the U.S. financial system. And today, being cut off from the U.S. financial system is virtually synonymous with being excluded from the global economy itself. China understands this dynamic perfectly. For over a decade, it has been diligently constructing alternatives. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, as a challenger to the Western-controlled SWIFT system, and crucial bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia to purchase oil in yuan. In 2022, Saudi Arabia confirmed it was actively considering accepting yuan for its oil sales to China. This news sent ripples through global markets. Should the world's largest oil exporter begin accepting a currency other than the dollar, the very foundation of the petrodollar system would undoubtedly begin to fracture. Russia, following the extensive sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine, significantly accelerated this de-dollarization process. Agreements with India and China denominated in local currencies. Furthermore, the BRICS group, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, alongside several recently added nations, is now actively discussing the creation of an alternative currency for international trade, one that would operate entirely independent of the dollar. So, is the petrodollar system on the verge of collapse? Not yet. The dollar still accounts for approximately 58% of global central bank international reserves. The euro comes in a distant second, with less than 20%, while the yuan barely surpasses 2%. This system possesses immense inertia. Reshaping decades of global financial infrastructure simply doesn't happen overnight or even in a single decade. However, the direction of movement is unmistakable. What is occurring is a gradual de-dollarization, not an abrupt collapse, but a slow and steady erosion of its long-held monopoly. More countries are negotiating bilateral agreements outside the dollar. More central banks are diversifying their reserves into gold and other currencies. And more emerging economies are actively exploring alternatives to the SWIFT system. And make no mistake, these shifts carry direct consequences for your everyday life, regardless of whether you reside in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, or Spain. Should the dollar lose its dominant status, the cost of importing raw materials, technology, and energy will fundamentally alter for all nations. Global interest rates will be redistributed. The power to impose economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool will diminish significantly. In essence, the entire map of global power will be redrawn. The petrodollar is far from a mere conspiracy theory, with measurable consequences evident across decades of geopolitics. It represents the invisible skeleton of the global economic order that emerged after World War II, and today, it faces its most significant challenge since its inception in 1974. The pertinent question is not if the system will change, it is already in motion. Rather, the questions are, who will control the narrative of this change? At what pace will it unfold? And which nations will successfully position themselves on the right side of history when the global chessboard is ultimately rearranged? Because when the petrodollar eventually relinquishes its throne, the world will fundamentally transform.